The morning it happened felt ordinary, in the way only calm moments before chaos ever do. The sun was already high, the pool water perfectly still, and the gate clicked open with the familiar sound of keys I'd carried for years. This pool wasn't just an amenity. It was part of the property agreement written into the original land deed, predating the HOA by decades. I'd memorized those clauses the same way some people memorize prayers. Quietly, thoroughly, permanently. I was halfway to the pool deck when I noticed her.
Karen.
Standing stiffly near the fence with that practiced look of authority, clipboard tucked under her arm like a badge. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She just stared, the way someone does when they've already decided you're wrong and they're about to enjoy proving it. "You're not allowed in there," she said sharply, stepping into my path. "HOA revoked your access." I didn't respond right away. I'd learned that silence unsettles people like her more than arguments ever could. I let the words hang in the air, then calmly replied, "That's not how this works." Her lips tightened. "It is now." She raised her phone slightly, as if the mere act of holding it granted her power. "If you don't hand over your pool keys, I'll call my husband." That was the moment I knew this wasn't just another HOA dispute. That was escalation. Weaponized authority. And Karen wore it proudly. I asked, evenly, "Your husband?"
She smiled then.
A thin, satisfied smile. "He's a cop." There it was. The threat, wrapped in faux legality. She didn't need rules when she had leverage. I could almost hear the version of the story she planned to tell later, how she'd handled a troublemaker, how order had been restored. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You're going to give me those keys." I reached into my pocket slowly, deliberately, and pulled them out, not to hand them over, but to let them catch the light. "These keys," I said, "are tied to a property right older than this HOA. You can't take them." Her smile vanished. "Watch me." She turned away, dialing with sharp, angry taps. "Honey," she said loudly, making sure everyone nearby could hear. "I need you at the pool."
"Yes. Now."
10 minutes later, a patrol car rolled up. Neighbors paused mid-walk. Curtains shifted. This was becoming a show. Her husband stepped out, uniform crisp, posture authoritative, eyes already scanning me like a problem to be solved. Karen wasted no time.
"He's trespassing," she said.
Refusing to surrender HOA property. The cop didn't ask questions at first. He walked straight toward me. "Sir," he said, hand resting casually near his belt, "I'm going to need those keys." I met his eyes and felt something shift. This wasn't fear. It was familiarity. The cadence. The posture. The assumption of control. I'd seen it before, in training rooms, briefing halls, federal corridors where authority wasn't worn but carried. I took a breath.
Calm.
Measured. "Officer," I said quietly, "before you go any further, you might want to reconsider how you're approaching this." Karen scoffed behind him. He frowned. "Is that a threat?" "No," I replied. "It's a courtesy." And that was the moment the balance of power began to tilt, long before anyone realized why. By the time he reached the pool gate, Karen had positioned herself just behind his shoulder, close enough to feel protected, far enough to let him do the intimidating. Neighbors were openly watching now, phones half-raised, pretending not to stare, while staring anyway. The officer cleared his throat, squared his stance, and repeated himself, louder this time, as if volume alone could settle disputes. "Sir, hand over the keys. This is HOA property, and you're refusing a lawful request." I didn't move. I let the silence stretch, not out of defiance, but precision. "Before you take another step," I said, "you need to slow down and understand something important." Karen laughed, sharp and dismissive.
"He's stalling."
"Just take them." The officer glanced back at her, then at me. "Are you claiming ownership?" "I'm claiming documented access rights," I replied. "And I'm asking you, as a professional, to think carefully about jurisdiction before acting." That word did it. Jurisdiction. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Cops are trained to notice tone, confidence, vocabulary. I wasn't panicked or angry. I was calm in a way that suggested I understood consequences better than threats. He took his hand off his belt. Sir, what exactly are you saying? I'm saying this is a civil matter tied to land deeds and federal easements, I answered. And if you seize those keys under false authority, you're opening yourself to complications. Karen stepped forward. Listen to him. He thinks he's a lawyer. I met her eyes briefly. No, I said. I think he's a cop who doesn't want a federal headache. That got his full attention. He looked at me hard now, scanning posture and bearing. Years of training recognized patterns before facts. Federal? He asked. I nodded once. Undercover work doesn't come with warning labels.
The air changed.
Not dramatically, but decisively. He took a step back, creating space. Do you have identification? Yes, I said. But not for public display. Karen's confidence wavered. What is this nonsense? He raised a hand toward her, subtle but firm. Ma'am, please. That alone shocked her. The officer lowered his voice. Sir, if you are misrepresenting yourself. I'm not, I said. And if you escalate without confirming facts, it won't end well for anyone here. He exhaled slowly. Who's your handler? I gave him a name. A real one. His eyes flicked away as his brain did the math. He turned slightly, shielding his radio from Karen's view. Dispatch, he said, neutral. I need a quiet confirmation. Karen's face drained of color. What are you doing? He ignored her. The radio crackled softly. He listened.
Once. Twice.
His shoulders dropped. In that brief pause, everything shifted. The power Karen thought she borrowed vanished. Authority stopped being loud and became precise. Neighbors sensed it too, lowering their phones, watching more carefully. This was no longer a spectacle. It was a correction, quiet and irreversible. When he turned back, his voice was different. Lower. Controlled. Ma'am, this is no longer your issue. Her mouth opened. Excuse me? This is a civil access dispute, he continued. And you involved me under incomplete information. She spun toward me. You lied. I didn't respond. The officer handed me my keys back. The gesture mattered. Sir, he said quietly, I apologize for the approach. I nodded. Accepted. Karen stood there, stunned, watching the authority she'd tried to weaponize slip away. The crowd went silent. Control had returned to the right place. And for the first time, Karen realized she'd picked a fight far outside her neighborhood. The lesson would echo through the HOA for years afterward. By the time the officer stepped away from Karen, the crowd sensed something irreversible had happened. Authority had shifted, not loudly, but decisively. Karen stood frozen, clutching her clipboard like a life raft, eyes darting between her husband and me as if waiting for someone to declare she was still in control. No one did. The officer turned slightly, angling his body away from her. That alone spoke volumes. Ma'am, he said, measured and firm, you need to step back. It wasn't a request. It was a boundary. Karen opened her mouth, then closed it, clearly unused to being sidelined in her own performance. She tried again, voice higher now. He threatened you. He refused a lawful order. There was no lawful order, the officer replied. And you put me in a compromised position. That word landed hard. Compromised. Karen blinked rapidly. I was just enforcing HOA rules. You're not authorized to enforce anything through me, he said. Especially not personal disputes. The neighbors leaned in. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was accountability unfolding in real time. Karen turned on me, anger breaking through the shock. You planned this. You tricked him. I shook my head once. You escalated. I responded. The officer looked at me again, quieter now. For everyone's sake, I'm going to ask you to leave the area for the rest of the day. Karen laughed, sharp and brittle. You can't tell me that. I can, he said. And I am. Her face flushed red. She looked around, searching for backup that wasn't coming. Phones were still out, but now they weren't recording drama. They were recording consequence. She spun back to her husband. You're really going to let him get away with this? He didn't hesitate. This isn't about him. That was the moment something in her cracked. Years of borrowed authority collapsed into silence. She took a step back, then another, muttering under her breath. The clipboard lowered. The posture shrank. The officer turned to me one last time. If there's any further contact from the HOA, he said carefully, document it. And don't engage. I won't, I replied. I never do. He nodded, then walked back toward his car without another glance at Karen. The patrol car pulled away slowly, leaving behind a vacuum where her power used to be. No one spoke for a moment. Then a neighbor exhaled and said quietly, "Wow." People dispersed in small groups, whispering, replaying what they'd seen. Karen stood alone by the fence, staring at the locked pool gate like it had personally betrayed her. She finally turned and walked off, heels sharp against the pavement, each step louder than the last. I stayed where I was, calm, key still in my hand. The pool water hadn't moved, but everything else had. That afternoon, messages started circulating. HOA group chats lit up. Questions replaced commands. Stories changed tone. By evening, Karen's name was being spoken carefully, no longer with certainty, but caution. She'd tried to use the strongest card she had, and instead of winning, she'd exposed the limits of her reach. For the HOA, it was the beginning of a reckoning. For Karen, it was something worse. It was the moment everyone realized she was bluffing. And once that illusion shattered, it could never be rebuilt the same way again. Authority, once questioned publicly, loses its edge. Every future demand would now be weighed, doubted, and challenged. Karen didn't just lose this encounter. She lost the unspoken fear she relied on, and that loss would follow her everywhere in the neighborhood from that day forward permanently. The fallout did not wait for the next meeting. It started the same evening. HOA emails went quiet, then resumed cautiously, stripped of their usual threats and bold fonts. Karen was absent from the neighborhood walk she never missed. Instead, her husband's patrol car was conspicuously nowhere in sight, a silence louder than sirens. People noticed. They always do when power retreats. By nightfall, my phone buzzed steadily. Neighbors asked questions they'd never dared to ask before. Was the pool really tied to old deeds? Could HOA rules be challenged? What happens when authority crosses a line? I answered carefully, never gloating, never escalating. The point wasn't humiliation, it was clarity. Once people understand the rules, intimidation loses oxygen. The HOA board called an emergency session the following morning. Not a confrontation, not a demand, but a request. Language matters. They asked for documentation, clarification, and time. Karen was not CC'd. That omission said everything. When an institution begins distancing itself from its loudest enforcer, the internal panic is already underway. I attended the meeting remotely, camera on, voice steady. I laid out the history of the property, the clauses everyone ignored, the access rights predating the HOA itself. No threats. No federal references. Just facts. Facts are devastating when they can't be shouted down. Board members nodded, typed notes, asked procedural questions. The tone was almost apologetic. Karen joined late. Her camera stayed off. When she spoke, it was defensive, clipped, careful. Gone was the certainty, the barking confidence. She tried to frame the incident as a misunderstanding, a miscommunication. No one interrupted her. No one backed her either. Silence is brutal that way. The board chair finally spoke. He thanked everyone for their patience and stated, plainly, that HOA authority did not extend to confiscation, intimidation, or leveraging personal relationships with law enforcement. That sentence alone redrew boundaries the neighborhood had needed for years. Karen said nothing after that. Within days, policy memos went out. Procedures were revised. Complaints required documentation. Enforcement required votes. Individual discretion vanished. The HOA didn't apologize publicly, but it didn't need to. The shift was obvious. Karen's name stopped appearing on notices. Her role shrank quietly. Around the neighborhood, behavior changed. People walked straighter. Conversations grew bolder. When rules appeared, they were read instead of obeyed automatically. Fear had been replaced by literacy. That was the real victory. Not the pool, not the moment with the cop, but the collapse of unearned authority. I returned to the pool one evening alone. The gate opened smoothly. Water reflected the sky like nothing had happened. But something had. The space felt reclaimed, not just physically but symbolically. It belonged to everyone who understood their rights now. Karen still lives nearby. We pass occasionally. She avoids eye contact. Power doesn't vanish, it drains. And once drained, it never refills the same way. The HOA learned a lesson it couldn't undo. Authority borrowed through intimidation always comes due. And when it does, it leaves silence, caution, and a permanent record behind. That record lingered in conversations, emails, and cautious glances for months afterward. Rules were questioned, votes were counted, and personal grudges lost their camouflage. The neighborhood grew quieter, but healthier, like a system flushed of noise. People learned to ask, verify, and document. Karen learned to hesitate. And I learned that restraint, paired with preparation, changes outcomes more reliably than confrontation. The pool keys remained in my pocket, ordinary metal carrying an extraordinary reminder. Power is accountable, or it is temporary. Everyone watched carefully, remembering how quickly assumed authority collapsed when challenged by quiet facts alone. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood settled into a quieter rhythm, but it was a different quiet than before. It wasn't fear-based silence or avoidance. It was the calm that comes after clarity. HOA notices arrived with neutral language. Meetings had agendas and minutes. People asked questions without whispering. Karen's presence diminished, not by force, but by relevance, fading in daylight. I kept my routine unchanged. I swam in the evenings, locked the gate, waved to neighbors, and documented everything as I always had. Preparation isn't paranoia, it's respect for reality. The pool remained open, the keys remained mine, and no one attempted to test that boundary again. When authority meets certainty, it usually chooses a different target. Karen tried once more indirectly. A third-party email suggested shared access reviews. It was politely declined with citations attached. There was no follow-up. Her strategies had relied on momentum and intimidation, and without those, they stalled immediately. The board understood that liability had teeth, and they didn't intend to bite. Neighbors began sharing their own stories. Fines reversed. Notices withdrawn. Easements acknowledged. The HOA didn't transform into a benevolent institution overnight, but it learned restraint. That alone changed everything. Power became procedural instead of personal, and that shift protected everyone. As for the officer, I saw him once at a grocery store weeks later. We exchanged a brief nod. No words were necessary. Professionals recognize lines when they're redrawn correctly. He hadn't lost authority. He'd preserved it by stepping back at the right moment. That matters. Karen avoided me after that. When paths crossed, she looked past me as if I were a structural feature, inconvenient but immovable. Her confidence never returned to its former volume. People remembered. Authority, once exposed, doesn't reassemble easily. It requires trust, and trust doesn't grow where leverage was abused. The lesson spread quietly. New residents asked better questions. Old residents shared documents. Meetings became boring, which is the highest compliment governance can earn. Drama starves without attention, and the neighborhood stopped feeding it. I didn't celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate. Rights aren't prizes, they're responsibilities. You maintain them, document them, and exercise them calmly. That's it. The moment taught me that restraint paired with readiness outperforms confrontation every time. On a warm evening, I sat by the pool and watched the water settle after a dive. Ripples faded into glass. It felt appropriate. Power had rippled too, then settled where it belonged. Not loud, not borrowed, grounded. Karen's move had been bold, but ignorance often is. When she sent her cop husband, she assumed the uniform would end the conversation. She was wrong. Uniforms matter, but boundaries matter more. When those boundaries are understood, enforced, and witnessed, the outcome becomes inevitable. Nothing dramatic happened after that. And that was the point. The neighborhood learned how to function without fear. The HOA learned its limits. And I learned, again, that the strongest position is quiet confidence backed by facts, patience, and the willingness to let truth do the heavy lifting. I didn't need applause, validation, or victory laps. Stability was the reward. Boundaries held, processes worked, and respect replaced bluster. When people know where lines are, conflict fades. The pool stayed quiet, the gate stayed locked, and the neighborhood moved forward. That is how real authority endures. Measured, accountable, and boring. It never announces itself, never bullies, and never borrows power it cannot repay. Those lessons last, especially when learned publicly, calmly, and without raising a voice. Quiet facts closed the chapter, and the water reflected nothing but sky, finally, steady and clear.